Today, we know that New York is facing a daunting fiscal crisis because of the pandemic and its related economic fallout. The state is facing a $15 billion budget gap this year and a projected $39 billion gap over the course of the next 4 years. Now, we know that Washington has a critical role to play in supporting New York to help address this gap, but it remains to be seen to what extent Washington will bail out our state. The conditional executive budget, if Washington does not bail out our state entirely, includes cuts of approximately $6.4 billion, largely to education, Medicaid, and local aid programs, which would add more burden to communities of color and low-wage working New Yorkers who have carried the weight of the pandemic on their shoulders. How have working New Yorkers carried this weight? Well, unemployment has skyrocketed as jobs disappeared. We lost more jobs during the height of the pandemic than during the Great Recession of 2009. New York has already lost over 1 million jobs since the pandemic began, with over 500,000 lost in New York City alone. And such job losses have been disproportionately concentrated in low-wage sectors and in communities of color, which has led to the widening of the already pre-existing income and wealth gaps in the state. But the truth is, wealth and income inequality has been on the rise in New York and across the country for decades. Since 1989, the share of all wealth owned by the top 10% of households has increased from 61% to 69%, while the share of wealth owned by the bottom half of households fell by 50%. So this is staggering. It is important to point out as well that the COVID-19 economic downturn is considered the most unequal recession in US history, with the lower end of the economy suffering the most financially. And as New Yorkers continue to suffer these major financial and economic blows, we have seen that large corporations and high earners have, in several cases, profited even during a pandemic. For example, the net worth of the 118 billionaires in New York State increased by 77 billion just from mid-March to mid-July of 2020. We also know that corporate profits reached a historic high of $2 trillion during the pandemic. So what does this all mean? There will be substantial pressure on the government to deliver to low-income and working families who have been the most negatively affected and impacted by the pandemic. So now is not the time for austerity budgets. Secondly, as we've seen, there remains a sizable tax base in New York State by which to increase revenue because of the concentration of wealth and high profits of financial corporations, including those high profits and wealth generated during the pandemic. So our report highlights that personal income, accrued wealth, and financial transactions are areas that the state should strongly consider when thinking about tax reform, as these areas have the potential not only to increase substantial revenue for the state, while addressing stark income and wealth inequality that has grown ever wider since the pandemic began. Our report goes into some of the considerations when taxing these particular areas, the pros and cons, et cetera. So I'm now going to turn to my colleague, Debipriya Chatterjee, who's going to go through the report in much more detail. Over to you, Debbie.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining. My name is Debipriya Chatterjee. I'm a senior economist with CSS. And just like Emerita said, with the current background of increasing inequality and the state and the city looking at a fiscal crisis, we wanted to see what were some of the levers we could recommend as policy analysts in addressing the difficulty of the present times. So mostly in the first part of my presentation, I'm going to zoom in on the points that Emerita has touched with provide you some more information. And then we are going to look at the tax reform areas that we have outlined above. So we're looking at combined budget deficit of about 15 billion for the next two state fiscal years. And that grows up to 39 billion in the outer years. So one of the immediate reasons or one of the immediate motivations for looking at these kinds of tax reforms is naturally so that we can avoid an austerity budget, because to meet a $15 billion budget gap would naturally imply otherwise is a deep cuts into essential services, some of which are lifeline for low income and vulnerable New Yorkers. The cuts that have been proposed in the executive budget total to around 6.4 billion. And these are serious cuts to education, both higher education, public health, in the wake of a pandemic. And we are still battling the worst public health crisis of this century, probably, and deep cuts to local government. There is, and all of the cuts, the point that we have to remember is that a cut today has consequences that last for generations. So if we are employing austerity budget for education or public education, the long-term effect of that in a reduced quality of human capital or quantity of human capital is going to show up as the state proceeds through the next few years. It's not a matter, it's not just numbers on balancing the book. Those are actual disinvestments for among the New Yorkers. So taking a step back to remind ourselves what the context is over here, we have the labor market, which kind of is going through a catastrophe right now, starting with the onset of pandemic. The current unemployment rate of 8.1, this is statewide unemployment rate, matches the worst the unemployment rate that the state experienced during the Great Recession. So we are currently at the worst point of what we were during the Great Recession, although it feels like we have improved, because we have improved, because at the peak of pandemic, the unemployment rate was 16%, double that of what we experienced during the Great Recession. And the blue bars, they are the jobs that the state held, annual numbers of jobs across the state. And we have lost over 1 million jobs, 500,000 of them only in New York City. And then here is the more tragic angle to it, that the jobs that have been lost, they are mostly in the low wage income sectors, and a lot of them are not coming back. So this is a graph from the Opportunity Insights, where they are using current data from payroll services and job postings to show that the pandemic and the related recession is essentially over for high wage workers, those who make more than $60,000 annually. But for the middle income workers, it is still there. Their employment is still depressed by 6.1%. And for the low wage workers, the acuteness of the recession is the most. They are still 22% less than what they were in January of the last year. So a year ago, when the pandemic hit the economy. So the entire analysis has to be has to be understood, or has to be, as we work through these arguments and look at these proposals, this is the picture that I want you to keep in mind going forward, that it is the low income workers that are hurting the most. For today's presentation and the report, we have focused on three areas of reforms for revenue raising: personal income, accrued wealth, and financial transactions. The reason we chose these three areas is because we feel they're sort of interconnected, and also because they are the prime source of driving the hyper inequality that characterizes our state. So personal income for the very high end is mostly coming from the financial sector. A lot of it, because of the preferential tax treatment, does not get taxed fairly, and goes on to add to accrued wealth for such households, and which they go on to invest again into financial assets through the stock market and so on. So these are the three kind of sort of related areas that we have chosen to focus. And I'm going to now walk you through our motivation for the reforms that we are proposing. So within personal income, the first thing we have to look at when we are talking about personal income taxes in New York State and also New York City is the extremely unequal nature of the distribution. So in this table over here, 97.4% of filers who earn below 500,000 have the share 46% of the income pie. If you think of whole taxable income produced in New York State as a pie, then they are sharing 46% of that, and they are sharing 51% of the tax liability. However, people making over $1 million a year, who are 1.1%, the 1%ers, and they are around 122,000 of them. So 122,000 New Yorkers also sharing this almost the same size of the pie, around 45% of the economic pie, and they have a tax liability of 40%. As we go zoom further into the higher slices of the income earners, we will see the same pattern being repeated over and over again. The 1% of the 1% has a greater income share and has a smaller tax liability as we look up the spectrum. And the other thing I would like to draw your attention to is the composition of the personal income. It varies a lot depending on where in the income distribution you are. If you are most of the regular New Yorkers, they get most of their income in the form of wages, but the high earners get most of their income in the form of capital gains or investment income. And these have, and the reason I am highlighting this is because the tax policies are different. The tax rates that are employed, the effective tax rates are different for the kind of income that it is being applied to. So 79, 80% of wage income comes from New Yorkers who earn below $500,000, but 82% of capital gains come from New Yorkers who earn over $500,000. So that would be the 125,000 that I showed you in the previous table, right? So, so this stark difference in the composition combined with the highly unequal share of taxable income and tax liability are the two major points that we have to remember as we look at increasing personal income tax rates. So the senators that we have among over here and have proposed a variety of bills, most of them targeted at raising the top tax marginal income tax rates. What are the ramifications of that? It raises revenue, of course. That's what we want over here. It reduces inequality by making the post-tax distribution fairer, by allowing us to provide more in transfers to those at the lower end who are probably not as fortunate and has not been enriching themselves during the pandemic. And finally, and this point gets obfuscated in most debates, it's that this revenue, when invested in New Yorkers, it's a pro-growth investment. When you take this revenue and invest it in education, it's not a giveaway, it's not a handout. It's something to grow the economic pie. So, and as we saw before, when you grow the economic pie, the top earners who own a large share of the economic pie, they will also get more in returns, right? So this is the classic. There's no equity efficiency trade-off that is happening over here, so long as you invest, and we badly need to invest in infrastructure, in education, in public health, and in affordable transit, affordable housing. And so what this brings us to the critiques. They are going to point out that, you raise taxes on the high earners, they might leave the state. So the migration of high earners. Well, that's a valid point, and there are some studies suggesting that it's happening. But the weight of the evidence, and that we have analyzed, or when we researched, we found it overwhelmingly supports the fact that the migratory millionaire hypothesis is kind of a misperception. It's more of something that you want to believe because it's kind of makes sense, but the empirical evidence does not hold it. It does not hold up. The weight of empirical evidence does not verify it. It's kind of how the debate for minimum wage was until very recently, when you thought that increasing the minimum wage would lead to loss of jobs. But now the whole economics profession has come around to almost accepting that the job effects, the employment loss effects are not much. So this is something similar happening here. The migratory millionaire hypothesis has not been shown to borne out in California in the 3 rounds of tax rate hikes that they did on the millionaires. For New Jersey, when it increased tax rates on half millionaires, like making 500,000 or more. And then the millionaires that they did more recently. Same for New York. The number of high net worth individuals in New York after it passed a surcharge in 2009 after the Great Recession has increased by 10%. So we have richer, wealthier New Yorkers that have flocked to the state over the past decade, even though New York is one of the highest states with a very high tax burden. So So that's our take on it, that it's true, but it's the weight of the empirical evidence does not bear it out. Moving on to the next category, accrued wealth. So accrued wealth, that any proposal about taxing accrued wealth has to be understood in the context of wealth inequality. Wealth inequality, as probably everyone is aware, in this country has been rising over the last 30 years. In compared to 1989 to 2019, the top 10% households, they increase their share of the total wealth, and they also increase the median net worth. So here I have a chart showing the median. This is like the average, the typical person, in the middle of the top 10% of the wealth households. So the y-axis is thousands of dollars. So in 1989, the top 10%, the median wealth was 1.3 billion, and now it is 2.5 billion. And you can see the rest of the graphs. You don't even need to read the labels; they're all flat. So everyone else really did not have that much of an increase in wealth over the past 30 years. Similarly, wealth inequality was stark to begin with, but it worsened over the pandemic. The bottom 50% has 2%, owns 2% of the share of all wealth, only 2 trillion. But the top 1% have 35 trillion. That's a trillion with a T, which are 30% of all the wealth. And I would just like you to, if you can see it, I don't how well you can see it on your screen, but like to draw your attention to the little dip over there at the end, after which the wealth accumulation has rebounded and reached an historic high of 35 trillion for the top 1%. When you stratify wealth inequality by race, the picture is even more dismal. Median net worth of white households is close to $200,000, while that for a black households is $24,000. So, and it is, these are not just a matter of stark statistics and visualizations. This is actual. This translates to actual differences in opportunities that communities have. So, wealth provides credit for education, for opening a business, for entrepreneurship, for innovation. You have a great idea, but if you cannot put up collateral for credit, it does not really translate to increasing your wealth or well-being. So that's why we are focused on understanding and ways to combat wealth inequality in the state. And about taxation of wealth, the next thing that we need to remember is, just like personal income, the composition of wealth is also very different when you move across the spectrum. So for most regular New Yorkers, or for most regular Americans, wealth is in the form of their houses and any other assets like cars or whatever they might own. But for the top 1%, wealth is in the form of financial assets. That is the red kind of slice of the bar over here. And as you see, we are moving from bottom 50 to next 40, next 9, and the top 1%, the size of the red bar continues increasing, meaning that the most of the wealth that they have is in the form of financial assets. So what is the take on taxing wealth, and how is it going to work out? One of the challenges, and I'm here beginning with the critiques here, that is put forward is the constitutionality of taxing wealth in New York State. While the taxing of intangible wealth in New York State is probably not constitutional, what might be constitutional, and here we are just reporting to you the analysis that we have seen and the recommendations that we have from legal experts, but we are not experts, so we are speaking this with a caveat. If you are taxing the increases in the value of the wealth, that's why we are referring to it as accrued wealth, the increase in the value of the wealth, not the wealth stock itself, that probably might be constitutionally legal in the state. And then with every tax hike, there is of course the migration of the wealthy is a possibility. And again, when we analyze the evidence, we find that is typically not the case. The wealthy do not flee their state of residence as soon as the rate is increased. However, there are certain considerations. We have to keep the rate of tax should not be so high that it affects moderately wealthy people, because that was the case what happened in France when they increased that rate by a lot and everyone was affected. There was a lot of out migration to UK and so on. And also we have to be aware of tax evasion that the rich might avail of to hide their wealth, to avoid taxation. However, because most of their tax is in the form of financial assets, it would be easy to administer because you can attach a price to most of the financial assets, even if they are not sold or bought in the market. Moving on to the last bucket area of our reforms, financial transactions. So as most of you probably are aware that even though the economy, the real economy has been hurting and their joblessness has been climbing, the stock market seems to be unfazed, right? The stock indices, S&P and DIGA and NASDAQ have been climbing to historic highs. Same thing with the corporate profits. Corporate profits have reached a whooping, insane 2.5 trillion over during this quarter of the past 2 quarters of the pandemic. Say the pattern of increased wealth for corporations holds the same for financial as well as non-financial firms. And so this is the time when we think that imposing financial transaction taxes of the kind that other stock exchanges already have might be feasible and a good idea. So one of the things that we, for example, we looked at was the stock transfer tax. It is a small tax. It is small in the sense that when the tax as a relative to the to the price of a share, it's really minuscule. And it also provides a lot of advantage for big trading companies because there's a cap of $350 that you can pay on the tax on any particular day. So if you're trading lots of shares that are priced very high, then the stock transfer tax is minuscule. The state already collects it and rebates it back to the financial firms. And we are looking at the possibility that there might be an elimination of the rebate, either complete or partial, and that might add some additional revenue to the state coffers. So for the stock transfer tax, it would raise revenue, it is easy to administer, and it's a small tax. These are things in its favor. Again, the same question comes up. Would that spur firms to migrate? Would that, and here, there's another associated question. If it spurs firms to migrate out of the state, would they still be liable for the transactions conducted through the New York Stock Exchange because of economic nexus kind of idea, right? So economic nexus standards say that the transactions that are implemented or executed in New York State would be taxable. So what would be what ramifications there? We feel that they would be falling under the nexus, then the standard would extend to them. But again, we are not corporate law experts, so we would like your feedback and your recommendations on this. One point that is usually pointed out for stock transfer tax, it's highly volatile because it is related to the market, and the revenue from that is going to experience big swings. For example, it can range from 5 billion to 13 billion in any given year, depending on how the market performance unrolls. So these are some of the issues related to the taxes. We look forward to your questions and comments during the Q&A session. And I would just like to conclude by reminding everyone the backdrop with which we started. There's a fiscal crisis. There's an urgent need to raise money to avoid austerity. And especially because the austerity in public services would doubly hurt the low-income New Yorkers who have been especially hurting from the pandemic. So it is the group that has been especially hurting is going to be the one who might be asked to make more sacrifices, and they would raise revenue, but also as a collateral, they would address the growing concentration of income and wealth.